stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review, and yes, my name is Jim Santelle. I am your host on these broadcast stations of civic media throughout the state of Wisconsin and beyond, joined in the studios of Civic Media here in Radio Park in Racine, my excellent producer, Max. And together in the next 2 hours, taking your phone calls, your questions, your comments, your inquiries, as always, about our ambitious, but yes, as always, achievable agenda, our syllabus for this weekend presentation. That number, 855-752-4842, 855-752-4842, inviting your involvement, your participation in our discussion of the major issues facing our nation and, yes, indeed, our world. Rule of law extends just beyond the borders of America into all nations on the face of the planet, underscored with very vivid precision just this past week on Friday, when the United States of America welcomed to the capital of our nation the leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, received in the morning a very favorable and warm and hospitable reception on Capitol Hill in the halls of Congress by representatives of our Congress, and only to return down Pennsylvania Avenue later in the day to receive just the opposite in the White House, in the Oval Office of the White House, at the invitation of the President and the Vice President of the United States of America. The conversation, as you all know very well, did not go well, and that is an understatement of huge dimension. One of the things that we're going to be advocating for is the understanding of what happened yesterday as a rule of law matter, as a justice matter, as a fundamental development, not only for domestic policy, but certainly for international policy that affects the ways in which we think about laws and morals and mores and the standards by which we conduct international diplomacy, but also protect and defend our domestic security as well. Proposition being presented to you in this edition of Amicus, a law review, is that on Friday of this week, a new world order established, a new world order that we have not seen since the end of World War II. We'll talk more about exactly what happened in the Oval Office at the White House late Friday afternoon. We'll talk about the consequences of that. And of course, we'll talk about all of that in the context of the larger issues related to this administration. And indeed, remembering once again that we gathered last weekend to talk about the new order established by this president domestically in declaring himself the king of our nation, the one who is single-handedly and unitarily responsible for deciding and imposing, articulating what the law is in America. That happened on February 18th. On February 28th, the foreign policy bookend to that happened when the President of the United States of America established not a domestic new order, but an international world new order, making complete his position that he is in charge, and that he is in charge in a way that is contrary to the Constitution and the laws of our nation. We'll talk more about that as well. We necessarily need to talk as well about domestic matters happening in our nation. We will return to a common agenda item that we have talked about before, and that is what's going on at the Department of Justice under the administration of newly appointed Attorney General Pam Bondi. I'm going to talk about one of the major changes that once again fell somewhat under the headlines across our nation. She re-articulated the standards according to which Assistant United States Attorneys and Department of Justice lawyers, prosecutors, criminal prosecutors, and candidly even civil litigators inside the Department of Justice are to make decisions about the cases in front of them when it comes to charging or not charging. It sounds wonky. It sounds very academic. And yes, indeed, at some levels it is. But it changes once again the ways in which laws, the federal laws in the districts in which you live, Eastern District, Western District of Wisconsin, all the other 91 districts throughout our nation and in our territories, changes the ways in which cases will be prosecuted by the Department of Justice in your neighborhoods, in your communities. We'll talk about what Pam Bundy has done, and necessarily then returning to another one of our favorite, often visited subjects, and that is, of course, the Supreme Court. Moving right down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to Main Justice and U.S. Attorney's offices, and then returning to Capitol Hill, where the United States Supreme Court has once again been busy this week. We'll tell you a little bit about the summary of cases. We'll talk about the oral argument that had in one major case, in addition to three others, which we'll mention, of just this past week. Yes, somewhat, again, eclipsed by the major news stories of this week, but the United States Supreme Court busy in portions of its regular docket and also issuing a major case, a major decision to suspend for now the decision previously made by a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C., to stop Donald Trump from preventing the USAID monies from being implemented, from USAID being active, not only in the United States, but plainly its principal purpose in nations overseas. We'll talk about the suspension, the hiatus, effectively, the stay that the Supreme Court has placed upon that order, telling the Trump administration until that stay that it could not, in fact, bring the USAID to its knees. The Supreme Court intervening this past week to suspend that order. The implications of that, again, are huge, as are other things that are going around in the courts of our nation, having to do, yes, indeed, with the employees, the workers, the civil servants of our nation. 340 million people in our nation as of approximately right now, 2.4 million of them in the federal workforce. Now, plainly not all of them have been affected by the dramatic draconian things that this president, my president, has done in recent weeks to not only stop those civil servants from doing the assignments that they have been given, many of them across many, many different areas, but also limiting thereby the access that you have to government by virtue of stopping those employees from doing their jobs, limiting the capacity of government to support you and do its principal function, which is to serve you, to support you, to ensure that you're safe and secure, to take care that the laws of the United States, as the Constitution says, are properly and faithfully executed. We'll talk about some things that happened just this past week. Some good news, believe it or not, coming out of something called the Merit Systems Protection Board with respect to 6 of those 2.4 million employees. And we'll also talk about other things that are happening across the board in agencies of the federal government that, yes, indeed, affect you on a regular basis. Lots and lots of things to get to. As I often say, it is a lot. It is big. It is huge. And the news continues to animate all of us. Regardless of your own particular philosophical, political, partisan views about the world, there are things that are happening in America right now with which we must all concur. One of them was the subject principally of our discussion of last week here on this broadcast, Amicus, a Law Review. It was in that broadcast that I offered my non-hyperbolic assessment that, in fact, on February 18th, the previous Tuesday, the president not only had changed the Constitution once again, but probably with the encouragement and force and strength of what John Roberts and 5 other members of the Supreme Court had told him some 8 months earlier, that is, that he can be and should be active and nimble and strong and muscular, not entangled by things like criminal prosecutions, not entangled by other things that would prevent him from doing anything that he wants, not only granting him immunities from prosecution for crimes committed in the office, giving him complete, absolute immunity for engagements with, yes, that's right, the Department of Justice responsible for administering the rule of law in America. Not only doing that, but also articulating, as John Roberts did from his pen, a view of our presidency that we have never seen before. Donald Trump taking up that direction, that permission, that authorization given to him by the Chief Justice and by a modest majority of the Supreme Court, not without virulent, vigorous dissent from 3 members of the Supreme Court, taking up that instruction that he can do almost anything he wants. He indeed has set about to do just those things in the past 10 days. And so on February 18th, as we discussed at great length in our last broadcast, the United States president, my president, your president, said this. He said, no employee of the executive branch, the execution portion of our Constitution, second article of our Constitution, no employee of the executive branch, no one inside the executive branch, including not only cabinet officers and cabinet employees. We saw them just this past week for the first time gathered around Donald Trump's cabinet table, but also agency heads of other agencies that are independent. He said no employee of the executive branch acting in their official capacity can advance an interpretation of the law as the position of the United States that contravenes. You all know what that means. That means you can't object to, can't oppose the president or the attorney general's opinion on a matter of law. As he said last week at great length, l'état c'est moi. That, of course, coming out of Louis XIV in France and other traditions from Great Britain of the 17th century as well, that the president of the United States in 2025 declaring himself the law. And that applies, of course, to regulations, guidance, positions in litigation, everything. That's what he did 10 days ago, this past week, providing the bookend to that, creating a domestic new order, now creating a new world order, a new international order. Again, not hyperbolically stated, not overstating what happened in the Oval Office of just this past week, a new world order created by this president. Again, contrary not only to all of the presidencies that have preceded him, arguably with the exception of his own a couple of terms ago, but contrary even to the authority that he has under the Constitution. We'll talk a little bit about some of the predicates for that as well, and the importance of understanding the significance, the historical significance, the meaning of what happened just this past week in Washington, D.C., at the verbs and the adjectives and the nouns and the venom of our president in the White House. All of that coming up on Amicus, a law review. Is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, your host this hour and also next hour in our weekend, our weekly examination of issues related to the rule of law, justice, government, and the operation of our nation. And yes, indeed, our place on the face of the planet, joined here in the studios of Civic Media by my outstanding producer, Max. And together we are soliciting, encouraging your questions, your observations, your comments, about all things, especially including this major news story of just this past week. That phone number is 855-752-4842. You can call in. You can also drop a comment or a question, which Max and I will digest in the Dropbox here at Civic Media. We'll make certain that you're a part of our discussion. Let us begin, as we often do, talking about the rule of law with the United States Constitution, doing a bit of civics, as we necessarily do. A lot of people watching what happened yesterday in Washington, D.C., that calamitous, catastrophic exchange between the president, the vice president, and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, invited there, arguably anticipating the execution of an agreement, a treaty, if you will, that would have affected mineral rights, the possibility of opening a door to possibly a path toward peace in Ukraine. Unclear exactly how that would have happened. Never got anywhere near to that because of what happened in the White House, because of this intersection between the authoritarian nature of our current president and the domestically resigned and reserved, rather, view and posture of the Ukrainian president, who came there to advocate for his nation, which again is what leaders of foreign nations can and should do, and raising the question of, again, responsibilities for certainly our domestic policy, which we have talked about, but also our international policy. Let's go back to the Constitution. What did James Madison tell us about the authority that, yes, indeed, my president, Donald Trump, and to some extent, the vice president and others, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, also their ambassadors in the room in the Oval Office when this calamity happened? What does the Constitution say about the authority of the executive to engage in these kinds of engagements? And the answer is, it is certainly derivative, but you know it well. Among the most important powers, of course, in Article 2 of the Constitution given to a president are indeed the powers to be the commander-in-chief. That's the big one. That's the one that we talk about a lot, and even talk about recently when it comes to changes in the Defense Department, which we may get to later in the second hour or at a future broadcast. He is the commander-in-chief of our armed services. That is no small authority. But the Constitution also gives him, of course, the right, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties. Provided that 2/3 of the senators concur in that. And also the president given the authority to nominate, and also with the consent of the Senate, appointing ambassadors. And the Constitution implicitly provides other authorities when it talks about the obligation of a president to take care that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed, and to ensure that the commission of all officers of the United States of America are consistent with those laws. That's what the Constitution says about this international, non-domestic authority of our president. The reality is that Article 1, the legislature created once again by our founding fathers, says a whole lot more about the responsibilities of our Congress when it comes to international affairs, and you know what those are as well. The big one, once again, it is huge: to declare war, and involving the captures on land and water. That is huge. We haven't done that recently. There have been an awful lot of pieces of legislation that attempt to implement that, and we have plainly been involved in wars without declarations. But that is there. That is there in Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution. More significantly, or at least as significantly, commerce with foreign nations. Foreign nations, that's in Section 8, to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That is the third bullet point, if you will, of the express obligations of the Congress to become involved in international affairs, to engage in commercial regulation when it comes to our connections with our alliances, even our animosities toward foreign nations. There's reference to imports as well, all kinds of things, again, explicit and implicit in Article 1 of the Constitution, that grant the United States Congress authority in this area. Why am I talking about all that? Well, it is important to understand not only what the basis for what we saw yesterday in Friday in the Oval Office was all about, but also to understand that Congress has a role in this too. And we have seen plainly, not only, as I said at the top of our broadcast, the positive and very embracing reception that the president of Ukraine received by that Congress, by members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, early in the morning, breakfast meetings, individual meetings, a time of, frankly, celebration of the alliance between the United States and Ukraine, the alliance between the United States and our traditional allies, announced, articulated, reaffirmed in the morning on Friday by virtue of the authorities granted the Congress to become involved in these kinds of things. And when it comes to the specific reason for Volodymyr Zelensky to be here, that is this plan to execute this agreement about the harvesting, the involvement of the United States in getting minerals from the lands, the grounds of Ukraine, that's commerce. That's commerce with foreign nations. And although the president does have executive authorities, Congress necessarily involved in this. And so as we talk about exactly what happened yesterday and think about it in the context of the rule of law, important to recognize that the president has great authorities, but so does the Congress, something overlooked as we recoil from the horror of what happened yesterday, as the president unilaterally, not hyperbolic to say this, unilaterally reestablished the world order in about 7 minutes yesterday in the White House, in the Oval Office, in a conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky. How did this come about? Well, we know that Volodymyr Zelensky's arrangement to come to Washington was fairly hurriedly put together, again, presumably to implement this treaty, this arrangement for the harvesting of minerals from Ukraine. Was meant to smooth over as well some of the rift between the president and Volodymyr Zelensky, our president and the Ukrainian president. You recall well that in recent times, the president had not referred to Putin as a dictator, but referred to Zelensky as a dictator, had also said, without any foundation, misstating recent history, which every American knows to be untrue, that somehow Ukraine was the aggressor in this war, all of that causing a rift between Ukraine and our nation. The notion was that the president of Ukraine would come to this nation to try to address that and also to seal this agreement. It was pretty much demanded by Donald Trump. Ukraine would hand over billions of dollars worth of mineral rights, arguably to repay the military aid provided under the presidency of Joe Biden and Congress over the 3 years since Russia's full-fledged invasion in 2022, and that is what it was. I seemed to make nice with Mr. Zelensky by telling reporters on Thursday that they would have a good meeting. We'll talk about whether or not that meeting did in fact play out that way. It did not, as Amicus, a law review, continues. My name is Jim Santelle, and this is Amicus, a law review, our weekly weekend review of rule of law events, issues, concerns in America and beyond. Spending a good deal of our time this weekend talking about this world-changing, world order reorganizing event that happened yesterday, Friday, in Washington, D.C. Our president, our vice president, loudly, for cameras, rebuking the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, berating him, and in this explosive exchange, unlike anything we've seen before coming from the White House, telling him that he has not been grateful and does not deserve the attention that the president had initially invited to give to him. And so what do we know about the lead up to all this? An awful lot of hints now that we look back on this, to this changing world order that was effectively accomplished on Friday, that late this past week. We know that early in the week when Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, was there, Emmanuel Macron grabbing the forearm of our president and correcting him when it comes to this concept that somehow all of the support given by Europe and arguably by the United States, all of this was loaned to the Ukrainians for the purposes of this war, intended to be paid back. Emmanuel Macron making very clear the president is wrong about that, exhibiting not only a difference of opinion, a difference of facts, and articulating accurately, the president of France doing this, what was the reality, but also indicating this growing rift between our traditional allies in the established world order. Keir Starmer, who's the newly elected British Prime Minister, also appearing in the White House just this past week, not quite as dramatically as did Emmanuel Macron, but also exhibiting explicitly and implicitly disagreements with our president about understandings of world history very recently and about the nature of the relationship between our long-standing, arguably our strongest ally to this time. And then we also have, as you recall well, this incredible speech given by our Vice President, J.D. Vance, on February 14th to the security folks in Europe, the European democracies, in which he said that the greatest threat to our European allies was not from Russia, not from China, not from without, but from within. And rather than providing them with a sense of assurance about the continued world order in which we are allied with them, said that the European governments, including that of the United Kingdom, had retreated from their values, ignoring concerns on migration and free speech. And the speech itself, of course, receiving loud and articulate disapproval from our allies. Once again, all of that leading up to what happened on Friday of this past week in the White House. The encounter, after initially some indication that it would go forward as a diplomatic discussion, which we've often seen between allies, the shaking of hands upon the arrival of the Ukrainian president, some polite exchanges, even without great warmth. But the encounter, once again, very quickly turned hostile, overtly hostile, when they sat down. And, of course, the Ukrainian president there begins by talking about the predicates for the war, noting it went back to 2014 when Moscow, the aggressor, which again has been contrary to what the president has said about who the aggressor has been in this case. Moscow first seized Crimea way back in 2014 and occupied territory then in eastern Ukraine more recently in this war, begins to provide the predicates for the American people, for the international community, which all of us know to be true, thinking that that is plainly not controversial, as a part of his entreaty, yes, indeed, to our American president to strengthen the tie between our nations and to secure whatever he can do to ensure the security of his own nation against the aggressor, Vladimir Putin. However, our vice president sharply interrupts almost immediately, begins assailing Volodymyr Zelensky. He says this, he says, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office to try to litigate in front of the American media. You should be thanking the president, which indeed the president of Ukraine has done repeatedly, including earlier that day, thanking the American people, thanking the Congress, thanking the prior president and this president for the support that he has gotten in that war. Our vice president accused Zelensky of mounting a propaganda tour in the United States. He said this. He said, do you think it's respectful to come to the Oval Office and attack the administration? Attack. No indication whatsoever that that's what Zelensky was doing. An administration that's trying to prevent the destruction of your country. That was the opening foray in this shouting match that then ensued. Zelensky tried to respond. He said, lots of questions there. Let me try to unpack them. Not permitted the opportunity to do that. Said that the United States could feel threatened by Russia one day, which of course is entirely true. That's a part of the common understanding that has animated the alliances between our nation and Western Europe for years and years. The concern about a hostile Russia, a hostile China. Zelensky said appropriately, rightly, geographically, said, you have a nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future, indicating that indeed what you do, what we do in Ukraine may have implications for our own safety and security at some point in the future, as it does right now. That plainly triggered Donald Trump, who did not like the notion that plainly Zelensky was articulating rightly and accurately a history that Donald Trump has rejected in recent times. And also this notion that somehow this alliance is not as strong as it should be. Donald Trump cut him off and so said, don't tell us what we're going to feel. He said, you're not in a good position. He's speaking to Zelensky. You don't have the cards right now. And added, you're gambling with World War III. Amazing. Vice President continued, have you said thank you once? And again, the answer to that is yes, Mr. Vice President. There have been repeated expressions of thanks for years now, including just that morning. All of this gets worse. And you can hear not only the recorded version of this, it's just under 7 minutes long. It changed the world and reordered the world order quite dramatically. In those hostile exchanges and in the tone and the substance of what was said, Donald Trump reordered the world and the alliances that have existed between our nation and, yes, Ukraine, but also our European allies and other allies around the world who are now recoiling in disbelief as this has happened. Interestingly, some of the same congressmen who greeted Zelensky with great joy and great admiration and support earlier in the morning, by the afternoon, almost moments after this calamity happened, reversed their positions entirely. And again, rather than expressing their independent constitutional authority to engage in issues related to international affairs, including commerce, minerals, those kinds of things, basically said that they were wrong. And that Zelensky, among others, presumably in the present Ukrainian government, should resign because of the hostility shown in the Oval Office. In fact, the hostility was all ours toward Zelensky. Afterwards, curiously, our president came out and said that he and Zelensky had a very meaningful meeting. I suppose that depends upon how you define meaningful, but that he had determined that the Ukrainian leader was, in his words, not ready for peace if America is involved. He said Zelensky can come back when he is ready for peace. He said along the way that the president from Ukraine had disrespected the United States of America in its cherished Oval Office. Much was learned that could never be understood without conversation under such fire and pressure. That's the statement from our president. It's amazing what comes out through emotion. One of the final things that our president said, even as that calamitous exchange was happening, was that, gee, this will make good television. That's the statement of our president. And the rule of law takeaway, of course, is that, yes, indeed, the president has great authorities when it comes to the establishment and the maintenance, and yes, indeed, the changes, if those are appropriate in the world order. He has got authorities to do these kinds of things. He exercised those authorities in a way that John Roberts presumably would have supported if he had known about this when he wrote those words back in July of last year, giving the president huge authorities to act with great muscularity and speed and not entangled with things like laws and even tradition, even history. We also wonder where the United States Congress is in its execution under the rule of law of responses to this that in 7 minutes changed the world order yesterday, changed the position of our nation on the face of this planet. And now, using a Sharpie, as the president sometimes does, can redraw the alliances on the face of the planet. The question as we go forward this weekend and in the days ahead, will these reorderings domestically, the president is now the law in our nation, and the president has now redrawn not only who our allies are, but the ways in which we will interact with nations up until Friday, who were our foes, our enemies, who would like nothing more than to destroy us. All of those things have happened in the last 10 days. And yes, indeed, if you are concerned about the future of our nation, both domestically, I am the law. If you are concerned about our position on the face of this planet, we no longer have a relationship, presumably with our European allies, and we look now to someone else to lead the free world. Perhaps it is Macron, perhaps it is Starmer, perhaps it is the head of the Economic Union. Our president recently commenting about that and saying the economic unit, again, this is historically simply untrue, meant to, and forgive the language, but he said the EU put together to screw America. That is simply not true. That is not what the EU is all about, but it may well be that the EU may produce what we have been for all of our lifetimes, which is the voice and the face and the movement of democracy and freedom on the face of this planet, now being ceded presumably to someone else. Maybe, again, the French president, maybe the British prime minister, maybe the head of the Economic Union, who will take on what has been our role until Friday of this past week. We have got callers, and we appreciate so much their involvement in our discussion at this very important time in American history as we assess our status on the face of this planet. Rick from Waukesha. Rick, appreciate your being a part of our discussion on our broadcast.
Thank you, and thank you for taking this call. I have some important information because of my growing up on farms and around them.
Very good. Tell us about it, Rick. Yes.
People that became doctors eventually and ancestors of doctors and became beginners of universities and whatnot. And I kind of learned being around them on the farm as a hand for a while that there's certain words and things they do. Now, Civic Media has a farmers program on it. And I can't think of the woman's name, but she's very sharp. And she could help with this, what I'm talking about, with her knowledge. The value of that position on the planet where the Ukraine is and the property being amongst the neighbors they're with is so much larger than I don't think Donald Trump realizes, or he just knows what he wants. But you know, in America, when they mined the salt mines, they eventually used it for storing oil because of the problems they had with the Second World War with the outside tanks. So it became very valuable in that sense. And when he said so many questions, now if you want to put out a value of property, you have to figure out, if it's farmland, how much wheat do they sow on that property? Excuse me, I'm having an ear problem at the moment. But the value of the position for satellite connection by towers.
All kinds of things, right? Right. Absolutely, Rick, right? Property is important, right? And as you said, the relationships that we have with the people on that property are our longstanding traditions. Your views based upon your involvement with farms, your perspectives on that, hugely important. Again, underscoring the significance of what happened in America just yesterday. Rick, we appreciate so much the perspective that you bring to this discussion. We'll have more of this as Amicus Law Review continues. This is Amicus, a law review. My name's Jim Santelle, and this is the final segment of our first hour here on our weekend broadcast, taking your calls, your questions, as always, at 855-752-4842. Appreciate very much Rick's comments about his perspectives coming from farmlands, his involvement with words, language, positions on the planet, as he said, the importance of relationships, and the ways in which everything from salt mines to our doctors and ancestors are all important. Thank you so much for that, Rick. We also have calling in from Madison. Dick, appreciate your participation in our conversation this weekend.
Well, James, to the extortionist in chief, that's how I'm going to refer to him going forward, a little information. When they made that accusation about you don't have the cards, a nice comeback would have been, the cards were all there in my favor. At the beginning of this war, early into it, about 2-3 months in, I just read where they had about they being Russia, 19.6% of the land. Now they're at 19.2. I would call that a stalemate, but they've also lost close to 800,000 people. And then when he makes the accusation, nobody wants to fight the war with you. What about in Russia's case, employing North Koreans, and at the beginning of it, the Wagner Group, and he was so weakened at that point early in the war that he almost had a coup where they took over.
Right.
What were they, 100 miles from Moscow?
Yes, yeah.
And then they make that accusation. If they would have gave him the power, in my mind, in last summer, I mean, what he needed, and not stonewalled from this Congress, we could have toppled him. And I'm talking about Putin now.
Right.
And he would go away in a hurry if he loses in Ukraine, in my opinion.
Yep. And Dick, an awful lot of things we need to keep in mind. All the things you described plainly, obviously, the involvement of the North Koreans, as you say, the land percentages that are there, the things that happened early in the war and recently. We need to focus on those in trying to get a sense of what our president is saying makes any sense at all. It does not. As you just said, Dick, so very well. The things we heard, again, implicitly, explicitly from the president in recent times, completely wrong and belied by the history. Again, Dick, appreciate so much your initial comment as well about the extortionary aspect of all of this, that in order to sue for and maybe obtain some peace there in Ukraine, we need to have access to your minerals. An interesting and very troubling way of executing our foreign policy, our diplomacy. Our Secretary of State sitting right there, mum, throughout all of this. The ambassador from Ukraine with her hands in her head in her hands, disbelieving what is going on and seeing the demise of this relationship, the change in world order that you have so accurately previously described, Dick, describing again today here on our broadcast. Appreciate your comment tremendously. Also, Mark calling in this weekend. Mark, always value your perspectives on what's going on in America. And again, the legal implications, the broad implications of where we are right now in our nation. Mark, go right ahead.
Concerned about in Federalist 67. And of course, that I've said that before, and that Congress needs to step up here. And that Donald Trump shouldn't be talking about our foreign policy, our tariffs, and that kind of thing, because I think under Article 8, Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution, it is Congress that's supposed to be regulating our tariffs and duties and that kind of thing, rather than just the president on his own doing this kind of thing. It is just deeply disturbing. And of course, with Pete Hegseth now taking away our cybersecurity in regards to Russia, which is just kind of seeing, what they want to open us up to Russia, attacking our water treatment plants and our electric grid, and it's just all deeply concerning. And we're just seeing, that are we surrendering to Russia? It seems to me that there's that movement there, and nobody has courage enough to speak up against this president who has clearly just kind of lost his marbles, perhaps.
and articulating again a lot of things, maybe not even to justify what he is doing, but simply to recast the way in which we understand our world, articulating things again not only related to the genesis, the beginnings of this war. No, Volodymyr Zelensky was not indeed the aggressor in this situation, just the opposite. To your point, as you reaffirmed today, Mark, very important. It is Section 8. It's sub-point 3. The Congress itself regulates commerce with foreign nations. Hard to imagine, Mark, as you're saying, a subject matter that's more clearly within the ambit, maybe shared with the presidency, with the executive branch when it comes to this kind of thing. We're talking about this planned deal involving the harvesting of minerals and the acquisition of monies, arguably to repay some of the monies given to the Ukrainians to prosecute this war. All of that should be the subject of review and of analysis and of examination. Whether that arrangement, whether that agreement with Ukraine is right or wrong, that's the discussion that should be going on right now in America. And if indeed Volodymyr Zelensky had somehow stayed there, there was a plan for plainly a press conference afterwards. That would have been interesting to listen to as our president once again spars with our allies, including Starmer and Macron and others from the East Room of the White House. That was scheduled also, not executed in the day of the presence there by the Ukrainian president. Also supposed to execute this agreement. And in the calamity and the appropriate focus on the calamity that began this visit, issues related to the legitimacy of this plan and the long-term implications of what this plan would have for the United States, for Ukraine. What is the notion? Where are we headed on all this? That should have been the subject not only of our discussion, frankly, this morning and in other broadcasts across our nation, across the world. Instead, we're talking about this rift and this dramatic change again in the world order that animates us as we go forward. We know as well that all of this happens at a time when our formerly allies are looking to us for leadership. As I said before, an awful lot of people understanding now that there is a gap. There is a vacancy, if you will, in the leadership that should be out there. And the question is, who takes that spot? The premise, the theory advancing in this, our first hour of Amicus Law Review, is the changes happening in our nation. A huge domestic change 10 days or so ago, and then this additional dramatic change in the world order just this past week. Changing America, changing where we are on the face of the planet. When Amicus Law Review continues, we're going to talk about some domestic changes as well, affecting all of us. Stay with us for that.
Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review, and my name is Jim Santelle, your host for this, the second hour of our weekend broadcast, providing some insights and perspective, yes, some reporting on what happens in America and beyond, but also some assessment of what it means, and spending a lot of time necessarily in this weekend broadcast assessing the implications for justice, for the rule of law, for the administration of international relationships when it comes to what happened yesterday, Friday, in Washington, D.C. This incredible rebuke of the Ukrainian president by our vice president and our president. Interestingly, a couple of follow-ups to that all-important event that changes the world order, just as Donald Trump changed the domestic order 10 days earlier. A couple of updates to all of that, and one is that notwithstanding the things that our president has said about Zelensky continues to be the consummate diplomat. He says, among other things, that the relationship with the United States and with Donald Trump in particular is salvageable, and that he implicitly looks forward to a continuation of it, that we remain a strategic partner with him and his nation. That's the kind of thing that you say because you believe it and you mean it, and you want to promote the good relationship that has existed by virtue of using those kinds of words, unlike the words used by our president on Friday. By using those kinds of affirming things, you not only affirm the relationship, but you also establish yourself as the better person, do you not? That even though you've had this fight that now appears in the annals of history, world history, you are willing and you are able and you are prepared to go forward to try to repair what damage has been done and to continue with the partnership that has produced not a complete result, not a clear result there in Ukraine, but continues to push back on the very things that are anathema to our nation. Second, even while that is going on, the reaffirmation of our ally, of the Ukrainian president, to a continued partnership. What is he doing? Where did he go? He went overseas. He crossed that ocean that he talked about in providing some perspective to our president. He crossed the ocean. He appeared in London. And yes, indeed, he is now meeting with the prime minister, the newly elected prime minister, Keir Starmer, who appeared, yes, in that same chair in the Oval Office earlier in the week, plainly to talk about not only what happened across the ocean in Washington, D.C., but also perhaps to reaffirm inside this new world order the relationship between Ukraine and Great Britain. Interesting to see what Zelensky may do with others in Western Europe, including Emmanuel Macron, including the head of the EU, all of whom may now, in the wake of our president's apparent decision to vacate the position as leader of the free world, maybe one of them is going to become that person. And Vladimir Zelensky undeniably working on all of that, not only to continue to support the ties with the United States, but uncertain about where this is going, also engaging for the legitimacy of his nation, the security of the entire world, in reaffirming good relationships with Great Britain, with France, and with others. All of that happening in the wake of what happened on Friday of just this past week. Here on Amicus Law Review, we try to emphasize the rule of law takeaways. There are a lot of them from this event. There are an awful lot of rule of law continuing takeaways from the other things that this president has done just in recent days and weeks that have huge implications. And this event, this circumstance about which we will now talk, is the perfect segue, if you will, between the international aspect of what happened in the Oval Office on Friday and what happened about a week ago, also connected with our domestic tranquility, our security, our safety, and also our position on the face of the planet. You may recall well that briefly, and not with nearly enough clarity and nearly enough exposition last week, we touched on the fact that among the other things that my president did last week is to fire General Charles Q. Brown Jr., who up until that time had been an exemplary chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, responsible for supervising, again, in a military context, the operations of our armed forces inside the Department of Defense. He also fired Lisa Franchetti. She's the chief of naval operations. General James Slife, he's the vice chief of staff of the Air Force. And most ominously, as we also talked about, one of our callers also highlighted the significance of this too, focusing upon, yes, international issues, yes, domestic issues, but yes, also the role that lawyers inside the military play. Donald Trump also fired the officers who serve as the top lawyers of the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy there at the Department of Defense. None of those individuals, the judge, advocates general, none of those individuals being unsubordinate, none of them were leading some failing war, justifying their termination. General Brown's chief sin appeared to have been endorsing the military's, yes, that's right, their diversity efforts to ensure that our military forces look like America. The president apparently did not like that. For example, after George Floyd's horrific murder, which we've talked a lot about on this broadcast, General Brown appropriately, wisely, thoughtfully, caringly recorded a 4-minute video. And that thing reflected on his experiences as a Black Air Force officer and put in context the importance of diversity inside our military. Pete Hegseth, who, as you know, is our current Secretary of Defense, had previously questioned whether Brown had been promoted to the chairman position because he was Black. Shocking thing for our present Secretary of Defense to have said in the past. Hegseth, for what it's worth, long expressed disdain for the role of military lawyers in his 2024 book, a thing called The War on Warriors. That's written by our current Secretary of Defense. He derisively referred to the lawyers, again, a word that unfortunately came up during the course of his confirmation hearing. It is embarrassing to talk about it, but this is the language from our Secretary of Defense. He referred to the lawyers inside the Department of Defense, the judge advocates general, we call them the JAG officers. He referred to them as JAG-offs, and he blamed them for their restrictive rules of engagement. He blamed them for the counsel that they provide and for the review of everything from war crimes prosecutions of American service members to advice given in the field. Significant that General Charles Q. Brown, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, replaced by General Dan Razin, R-A-Z-I-N, that's in parentheses or in quotes, because that's his nickname, General Dan Kane, Dan Razin Kane. He's a retired 3-star Air Force general, never held any major combat positions, like the Central Command, which controls American forces in the Middle East, as you probably know. He now is in the position of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff there. Donald Trump long expressing great admiration for General Kane, saying that Kane told him in his first term that the fight against ISIS, remember this, could be finished in 1 week. That's attractive to Donald Trump, and he remembers that. Donald Trump also claimed that Kane had said that he loved Donald Trump. He would kill for Donald Trump, and that he put on a MAGA hat in front of Donald Trump, all inappropriate things for a military officer, decidedly supposed to be apolitical, nonpartisan to do. Nonetheless, he now is the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Department of Defense. Now, what about these JAG officers? Why are they so important? I've hinted at it already. Why am I revisiting this as a rule of law matter, which we should all be concerned about? And again, depending upon your assessment of the significance of this, respond inappropriately and respond with derision and with opposition, in opposition to what the president has done. Why? Because it is a fundamental premise of the lawyers inside the Department of Defense to provide that all-important counsel to the military chiefs there. It is very important that all of us understand what the role of JAG officers in the military is. They serve as advisors to the commanders. That's right, advisors. They cannot tell them what to do. But if commanders have concerns and issues about great numbers of things, everything from personnel issues to the ways in which battles are conducted in the field, it is the lawyers who know the rules of law, the rules of deployment. They understand how treatments of prisoners are to be conducted. They understand all of this. They don't command troops in combat, but they provide all important advice that ensures that when we engage in the very worst thing that Americans can engage in, that anybody on the face of the planet can engage in, and that is war, that it is done consistent with, yes, indeed, there are rules of war, and that we do that based upon our Constitution. We do that based upon common historical understandings to ensure that even as we do this horrific thing called war, we are doing it in compliance with what the United States has been all about. Legal standards, those things that are adopted and enforced by the Secretary of Defense, but really practically enforced by these JAG officers, are hugely relevant to combat operations. And so, as I just said, they can dictate the very tactics that soldiers use on the battlefield as commanders ask, is it now appropriate under these circumstances to engage in this activity? And yes, it is very difficult in the midst of a war, a battle, to call and ask the lawyers what to do. I get that completely, as do the officers themselves. But when it comes to planning, as does the Defense Department on a routine basis, it is important that the lawyers be in the room to ensure that whatever is done defensively and offensively is once again consistent with combat operations first and foremost, and those combat operations have inside them understandings about how those operations are to be conducted. Weapons commanders deploy, also a part of the focus of JAG officers, the treatment of prisoners as well. How do I know all of this? I know all of this because I worked with JAG officers when I was in Iraq. I was not a military attorney myself, but depended upon them hugely to ensure the legitimacy of our operation there in Iraq. When we come back, we're going to talk more about why that issue is so important, and also take your calls, your questions, as Amicus, a law review, continues. This is Amicus, a law review. My name's Jim Santelle, talking about the rule of law in connection with this decision about a week or so ago of our president to fire not only this well-respected and superb chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his name is Charles Brown, replacing him by Dan Raisin Kane, who is now occupying and cumbering that position, also firing the chief of naval operations, the vice chief of staff of the Air Force. And again, the position here, the view here coming from me is that most ominously, firing also the lawyers, the officers who serve as the top lawyers for the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. Those are the JAG officers there, and explaining why that issue, those firings are no less significant than the firings of the top military leaders there, focusing upon what it is those JAG officers do to ensure that our combat operations, the way we treat prisoners, the way that we engage in war, as stunning as that is even to say out loud, is consistent with fundamental understandings about humanity, the rules of war. Dismissing JAG officers does not change the rules, but it can, in fact, from my perspective and the perspective of anyone else who knows even a little bit about this, degrade the quality of the legal advice that the commanders receive. And that affects not only the operations of war and battle on the battlefield, but also our position, the integrity of what we're doing in the international sphere. If military lawyers are afraid to or somehow chilled from providing good faith advice for fear that it might anger the president, the immediate supervisors, the political leadership there, that enhances the chances that America's forces will make some catastrophic mistake. And that could, in fact, affect dramatically the course of war, the course of how we are perceived in the international arena, and yes, indeed, our very safety and security. The firing of these top JAG officers, again, spoke directly to me because of my great admiration for them during the 2 years that I was in Iraq. I was not among their ranks. I was a civilian from the Department of Justice. They're working on rule of law issues with judges and prisoners and corrections and police. But they worked also to provide, along with our rule of law office, there an awful lot of advice to General Petraeus and others who were responsible, giving them that sage advice that lawyers can and should provide, tremendously important to the operation of that effort. And yes, indeed, as I always say, I appreciate that the war effort there remains controversial. But inside that operation, I, to this day, view the operation of those JAG officers, those lawyers then, and to this day, as hugely important to ensure that whatever we did, not with perfection, was done well and was done with an understanding that there are rules that do, in fact, apply. That is a significant lesson coming out of what our president has once again done to reorder the military in connection with his continuing work, his attempt to restyle the very ways in which our government operates, including at the Department of Defense. A little later on, we'll talk about the latest at the Department of Justice. As always, appreciate callers. And in fact, this caller most appropriately because, Joe, it was you who last week called in and highlighted this very notion that the president had also fired the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and also these JAG officers. So appreciate tremendously, Joe, your contributions, your presence here again on Amicus, a law review.
Yeah, Jim, the world is hurtling in some interesting directions. Thank you so much for your show, and the background and the specificity of all is just fantastic. Thank your producer, but also thank your callers, the regulars such as Mark or LA Tom, whomever. But I want to particularly thank a caller from the last hour. His name was Rick, and he was talking about land itself, and it was a very interesting point he had to make. He was talking about farmland, and of course, Ukraine has been the breadbasket of Russia for decades and decades, and boy, they want it back. And when you were speaking of changes in stylings in the world order, I would say that Putin is looking for a restyling of what he had before under the Soviet Union. If you look at land, there are lots of things that it can provide: farmland, minerals, oil, water aquifers. But if you look at this, you look at a map, and that's so valuable to just look at a map. Location is a huge thing that is within the desire to have Ukraine back because of the access to the Black Sea, and they want a warm water port. But it's more than that. It is the prestige. Putin has said, former KGB guy, that he wants to return to the borders of the Soviet Union. Get out a map and look at that. Holy cow. We're talking about those countries that would be either part of the USSR again, or Russia, or what was described previously, the Iron Curtain. Remember the Iron Curtain?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're talking about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, East Germany, Czech Republic. I mean, come on, it's huge. It is extremely sobering to look at that map and realize this is what he would like to return to. He has said this in the past, what this means for Europe, what it means for us, and what it means for us if our president is now allying himself with Russia and not the EU and not our allies that we've had for 80 years, but instead a country which would like to return to the land grab it had previously. So I would urge people, look at a map, just
Yes.
type in Iron Curtain, and it's sobering. It's very sobering. Thanks, Jim, as always.
Joe, sobering indeed. Tremendous comments, tremendous. We like to do instruction and maybe from time to time homework assignments. I appreciate that homework assignment. Let me reinforce that notion again. It is worth it if you have not consumed the 7 minutes of history that happened yesterday in the Oval Office, as Joe and other callers have responded to. Also, let's take up Joe's good instruction, her good direction, encouragement to us to pull out the map and take a look at where Crimea is. Take a look at where those Eastern Bloc nations are. It is a huge amount of land, and it is also, Joe, as you implicitly said, it's also bordering on our allies right there, and that's the concern. When Volodymyr Zelensky says to our president yesterday, you know, there's an ocean, you've got that ocean, but the reality is, especially in 2025, in this early portion of the 21st century, that doesn't save you anymore. And your point, Joe, about the possibility that Putin, again, looking at a map as he certainly does all the time, having taken Crimea in 2014, now going into and not completely securing, but plainly seizing huge amounts of land already inside Ukraine, looking to those other nations, that's the concern. In addition to ensuring the sovereignty of Ukraine, but what happens next? What happens next? And as Joe, you said so articulately, that significance of the future. This is not just about what happens overseas in a place that's not so distant from us in the end, but once again, important to take a look at the map and see where we are in this new world order. Joe, appreciate very much the comments. Also the comments, again, highlighting what Rick has said as well. I'm going to talk more about all of that. I'm going to comment as well and provide some perspective. A couple of comments coming in from Dick in Cottage Grove saying that Trump's assertion that Ukraine started the war is simply untrue. He says we can no longer suffer people being nice to this international criminal. I've got another comment coming in on our text line. GOP representatives will continue to cower unless they hear from their base that they're unhappy. We can't be happy about Russia being embraced. Very good comments. We'll talk about that and more, including the Department of Justice, when Amicus, a law review, continues. This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle here, coming from the broadcast station of Civic Media and Radio Park Racine, joined in the broadcast studio by my excellent producer. His name is Max, and as always, taking your phone calls, your comments, your questions at 855-752-4842. And that includes Ali calling into our broadcast this weekend. Ali, appreciate your contributions to our discussion.
Well, I have several things. One is that Jack also oversees treaties, you know, in their law experience. They also do like what's right and what's wrong during military engagement.
Absolutely.
And therefore need to know about treaties.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that Putin had said quite a while back was he wanted Alaska back. And Alaska is not a huge ocean away. It's
Right.
just, I believe, the Bering Sea. So if he is allowed to take all of Ukraine's land back because they owned it at one time, Trump would be okaying this in essence. Also, I think that we all really need to go back to basics, the who, what, when, where, how, and why of Trump's actions. I believe that he tried to control the military as far as during the protests, wanting the military to shoot protesters in the legs. That's why he's getting rid of JAG, is that they're not going to allow that. And I think that he is hoping for that he can put a martial law into the country.
You get rid of the people, the lawyers in this case, who know what they're talking about, who are there to provide this service, right? As you said, Ali, not only with respect to treaties, but also the basic operations. You get rid of them, and therefore you see that there may be an easier path through these things that are plainly unconstitutional. We know well, and this is one of the references I think you're making, is to the former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, who was his defense secretary in the first term. He infuriated Trump. Remember this in 2020 by publicly imposing the invocation of the Insurrection Act, which is that legislation plainly which permits the president to deploy troops, right, to impose order in American cities. That's our version of martial law. Esper said, no, I don't want you to do that, to the point that you're making right now. And he was also the one, Esper, who resisted Donald Trump's demand that law enforcement, yes, indeed, shoot protesters, Ali, as you have said, who were demonstrating outside the White House. Didn't like what Mark Esper, who was the Secretary of Defense, was telling him about the restrictions on his capacity to work. James Mattis also resigned as Secretary of Defense, we recall, under Donald Trump, after Donald Trump had abandoned some of our allies. They were Kurdish in northern Syria, northern Iraq, ordered a precipitous withdrawal of American troops. All those kinds of things result in Donald Trump dismissing secretaries of defense and others. And all of that animation, as you have just said, Ali, important to put all of that in perspective when we understand about what happened just this past week as well. David's calling in as well. David, appreciate your contributions to our discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks. I was kind of interested in this from the viewpoint, like, if you look at the history of takeovers of nations, whether it happened in Germany, pre-World War II, the currency got devalued so much that everybody that paid obeisance to Hitler and saluted in unison would get daily cost of living. And if you hated Hitler and you would never salute, they would give you monthly or even annual cost of living. And this was at a time where they had the hyperinflation, when you had to have wheelbarrows full of money in order to buy a loaf of bread. So I just expect that Trump is trying to do that again. That if he ruins the American economy badly enough, that we would be able to, or he would be able to get more obeisance from everybody. So Ralph Nader and also Howard Zinn advocated local currencies, and I wonder if you can talk about them in a legal viewpoint. Is there a way that certain cities or states could come up with local currencies that couldn't be dominated by the whims of corrupt people?
Right. Again, David, appreciate not only the perspectives about history, which are important. We often say, of course, that history really doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that's what you're articulating here today. And also this notion that, yes, domestic matters, right, often do influence the conduct of presidents. International matters can also affect their engagement on domestic issues. It goes in both directions, so to speak. And economies, if they do in fact go well, prompt presidents perhaps to be emboldened somewhat, but if they go badly, can also prompt presidents to do things in other areas, including the international scheme, that are not in the best interests. And so we continue to watch, David, consistent with your appropriate concern about the motivations of our president. Maybe they're financial, maybe they're economic, as well as he marches us through these major changes. Without going into great detail, the reality is that when it comes to those issues related to commerce and money and the credit of the United States, all those things are also set forth in the Constitution. They're given to the Congress of the United States. Once again, this is the section that we're talking about a lot this week in Section 8 of Article 1. The Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes and duties and imposts and excises, to pay the debts and collect for the common defense, to borrow money, to regulate commerce, to coin money. And this is the point I'm getting to. This is subsection 5, to regulate the value thereof and a foreign coin, and to fix the standard of weights and measures. Now, a huge amount of examination of what that language means has gone on since the time that James Madison wrote it. But the notion is that it's the Congress that coins money and prescribes those kinds of things. Plainly, that has been amplified over the years. We've got the Federal Reserve today that has an awful lot to do with our economic policy. We've got, again, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing that does the very practical things of producing our currency and our coins. We've got the recent proposal, again, lost somewhat in the calamity of recent news by the current president, to get rid of pennies, right? To get rid of CENTS in our national currency. All that kind of thing is under our Constitution to be regulated by our national government and our Congress in particular. Not to say that local entities and counties, municipalities, towns, villages, and even states don't have roles to play when it comes to our economic vitality. But the coinage itself and those kinds of commerce things, worth another look to our Constitution as we think beyond that about the role of our president and the Congress going forward. Appreciate very much the call, David, and the perspective that invites even more of our examination of what our founding fathers said and where we are today in America. Appreciate all of our callers, again, calling in at 855-752-4842. You can also drop text, which Max and I will digest here in Civic Media's studio right here in Racine. I want to spend some time as well talking about Pam Bondi and the Justice Department. We have spent a fair amount of time in previous broadcasts reviewing some of the many things that she has done to change the ways in which the Department of Justice works. We know that among the many, many things issued by her on her first day in office, and certainly since that time, she has rescinded the Biden policy, again, under the Attorney General tenure of Merrick Garland, that prohibited the federal government from going forward to execute any federal prisoners. Doesn't apply to states, but a suspension of federal movement on the execution of federal prisoners facing the death penalty. She has rescinded that, and so indicated that it may well be that those remaining prisoners who may be on death row in the future and those who are still there could be executed under this administration. Beyond that, lots of other things. And we know that the Department of Justice continues to make news on a regular basis, breaking as well inside the Department of Justice. Huge issues related to who is working where. We saw the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan who resigned not too long ago, along with some of her associates there in the Southern District of New York. Some long-standing lawyers in the public integrity section at Main Justice in Washington also resigning over this petition to eliminate, to stop, to dismiss the still living and still out there prosecution of the New York Mayor, Eric Adams. That's still pending in front of a federal judge. A lot of people resigned over the motion even being filed by Emile Beauvais, the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General. Resignations going on there. We saw just very recently that in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the U.S. Attorney there, the interim U.S. Attorney likely to be confirmed as the permanent or reasonably permanent U.S. Attorney there in D.C., has now demoted about 7 of the top lawyers who were involved in some of the prosecutions that Donald Trump didn't like, including those against him, including those involving January 6th and other matters that are no longer consistent with Donald Trump's view of what happened in the past and what should happen in the future. All that going on inside of Pam Bondi's Department of Justice, including, of course, her supervision of the new director of the FBI. Yes, indeed, Kash Patel, responsible to the Attorney General as a part of the Department of Justice. That is how things work. That's the structure of the department. In connection with the structure of the department, again, Pam Bondi issuing lots and lots of policies. Not too long ago, she issued a new memorandum on sentencing and charging decisions. And as I said at the top of the show, this is very important because it changes the ways in which assistant U.S. attorneys in offices around the nation, and yes, indeed, attorneys at Main Justice in Washington, D.C., look at cases, charge cases. At what standard should they make those decisions? It is another change. It's a departure from the bipartisan consensus about the past, and including some failures on the war on drugs and mandatory minimum sentences. Now Pam Bondi is ordering that all prosecutors, in the absence of what she says are unusual facts, to charge and pursue what are called the most serious, readily provable offenses. Now, that language is very important. It has surfaced under other administrations as well. And why is it important? Because it is a change in this regard. In previous administrations, including the one for which I worked under Eric Holder, Barack Obama, including the past administration under Joe Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland, a 2022 memorandum reaffirmed a fundamental notion that said directed that prosecutors have discretion, and they should pursue only those charges that result in the advancement of justice, in mandatory minimum sentences after an individualized assessment of, here we go, the circumstances surrounding them. In other words, judges are presented with the positions of the Department of Justice that are premised upon an assessment of the particular defendant and of the circumstances, and yes, indeed, have choices to make about which offenses to charge, which ones not to charge, with the ultimate goal of doing what? Accomplishing justice, in particular cases on behalf of you and me, to ensure that the community is safe and secure, but doing that in a way that gives prosecutors, U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, people populating these various litigating offices at Main Justice, the capacity to make those individualized judgments that are important to the rule of law. The sentences of the past that have been premised upon the serious, most readily provable offenses that do not take into account the particular circumstances, an awful lot of people look at those and they say they've often caused unwarranted disproportions in sentences and severe sentences that are not consistent with the rule of law. Pam Bondi changing that past now to regard the prosecution of cases only when they're pursued under serious, readily provable offenses. More of that and more coming up here on Amicus, a Law Review. This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, and this is the last segment of our broadcast on this weekend. Value so very much the contributions that so many people have made to our broadcast this weekend, including very recently Chuck, who's dropped a note or two into our chat line, noting that piggybacking on Joe's very good comment about the maps of Europe and Ukraine, and noting, Chuck does, that until Vance interrupted, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, was beginning to explain that though separated by oceans, the U.S. feels the war's impact nonetheless. Exactly. Also, Chuck notes that Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world and unable to farm and export its grains. That was one of the primary reasons for global inflation and food prices blowing up. Again, echoing some of the comments from Rick and Joe. Chuck, appreciate very much that perspective as well. In our final moments and our minutes here on Amicus Law Review, staying there in Washington, D.C., marching right down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Department of Justice, back to the Hill, where the Supreme Court, of course, is located. A couple of significant things going on from the pens and the actions of our Supreme Court just this past week. Again, much of that eclipsed by the news coming out of the Department of Justice and the White House. Supreme Court continues to entertain oral arguments, and we spend a lot of time on this broadcast telling you more about those, the significance of those, all of that, of course, anticipating that sometime probably in May and into June, they'll begin to issue their decisions on these major issues. Just this past week on Monday, for example, a major oral argument having to do with the future of Ruben Gutierrez, who is right now one of those federal defendants on death row. Gutierrez versus Sayens, a case concerning the planned execution of Gutierrez. He was involved in a capital murder and sentenced to death for his involvement in a robbery and a killing back in 1998. The Supreme Court entertaining oral argument on that very important case, not just for that particular defendant, but for all of us who are focusing upon the death penalty in America these days. On Tuesday, Supreme Court had additional arguments in a case called Esteras versus United States. It concerns the factors that federal courts should use when deciding whether to revoke an individual's supervised release term. People are post-prison, post-incarceration. What are the factors that courts should use and invoke in determining whether or not their freedom from prison should be terminated and they should be sent back to prison for various pieces of conduct? What are the factors that should be used? That was on Tuesday. Also, they undertook a case called Perttu versus Richards, had to do with another criminal matter. Cases subject to something called the Prison Litigation Reform Act, sometimes called the PLRA. Do prisoners have a right to a jury concerning the exhaustion of their administrative remedies when there are disputed facts about that exhaustion? A lot of legal stuff going on there, but also an issue important to our federal prisoners. That was, again, on Tuesday. And finally, on Wednesday, a case very important to employment discrimination, arguably touching upon a lot of the jobs-related issues that we've seen coming out of the White House recently. A significant case involving Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services, an employment discrimination claim for minority groups. And this one does deserve a bit more exposition. Ames involves a rule that exists in some federal appeals courts that requires employment discrimination plaintiffs, the people who are bringing the cases forward, who are in a majority, for example, a racial minority or other majorities, immutable characteristics, if they're in a majority category, to carry a higher evidentiary burden than plaintiffs who are in a minority group. And this particular case involves a straight woman who was denied a promotion and then later demoted. And in both cases, the position she wanted was filled by a gay employee. Now, in most federal courts, plaintiffs who are in the position of the majority are treated no differently from plaintiffs who are in a minority position. And that's consistent with a case, a lot of legal history here, in a case called McDonald versus Santa Fe Trail Transport way back in 1976, that basically said that federal law prohibits racial discrimination against white people on the same standards as would be applicable if they were black. Everybody's got a fair and even playing field when it comes to Title VII lawsuits alleging employment discrimination. Again, in this case, the Supreme Court not resolving the merits of this particular case brought by Ames, but reestablishing this common fighting ground, if you will, the basis upon which an Ames-type plaintiff can, in fact, prosecute her case. Pretty much no one, including the Solicitor General, suggested that this background circumstances rule that was coming out of one of our circuit courts in particular should remain. And indeed, it's one of those situations where, as Neil Gorsuch said, everybody's in radical agreement, which we don't see all the time coming out of the Supreme Court. Everybody in the courtroom, all the people arguing or orally, all of the Supreme Court justices seem to agree that there's not much doubt about how this case should turn out, nor realistically should there be. And again, I hope that all of you digesting some of this should say, yeah, everybody should be on the same plane when it comes to arguing whatever their employment discrimination claim should be. Federal law and the decisions under McDonald, those cases that are guiding all of this, are clear that employment discrimination cases brought by majority plaintiffs should proceed on the same terms as any other employment discrimination case. And what that does, of course, is it means that when they finally issue this opinion in the Ames case, likely will be somewhat uneventful. Indeed, we've got Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who floated the idea of a very short opinion fairly soon, simply stating that the rules are the same regardless of whether a particular plaintiff is in the majority or minority. And again, Neil Gorsuch, who is often one of the justices most eager to remake some of this kind of law, seemed to endorse that proposal, anticipating that, and again, Ames will reestablish an important concept for everyone going forward when they allege employment discrimination, in this case called Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services. That happened just this past week. The other important thing in our last minute here is that the Supreme Court stayed an important decision coming out of a district court, issuing an interim order placing on hold a Washington-based decision that imposed a deadline when it came to this foreign aid that the president had suspended. The Supreme Court saying, we'll take a look at this, and while we're doing that, the decision of the lower court telling Donald Trump that he cannot do what he wanted to do when it comes to foreign aid and USAID, Supreme Court saying now, we'll stop that from going ahead. We're going to take a look at that, presumably fairly quickly, and get back to you. We're going to get back to you again next weekend here on Amicus, a Law Review, as we continue to address these issues of law and government and rule of law in our nation and across our planet. Have a good weekend, everybody.